Trump celebrates signing the latest version of the National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA for short, the massive bill that funds the American military, we wanted to point out an interesting change to the language of the bill. A new provision in the NDAA orders a study of ways the military could vet enlistees to screen out extremists who might be looking for a little free gun range training, which seems like a good idea. When the provision was first added to the bill by Democratic Congressman Pete Aguilar, it specifically sought to screen out white nationalists. The House approved that language. But when the Democratic House and Republican Senate got together to hammer out the differences in their versions of the bill, the white nationalist language morphed. The final version of the NDAA, which passed both houses and was signed by the president on Friday, instead requires the Department of Defense to study ways to screen military enlistees for extremist and gang-related activity. The change was first reported by HuffPost. And it comes despite urgent warning signs about the rise of white nationalism inside our armed forces. And joining me now is Naveed Jamali, author of How to Catch a Russian Spy, the true story of an American civilian turned double agent, and Malcolm Nance, MSNBC terrorism analyst and author of The Plot to Betray America, is back with us as well. I want to first, I'm going to go to you, Naveed, but I want to first read the statement from the spokesperson of the Senate Armed Services Republican side, who said, when we asked for a statement, and the response was, "This is absurd. The language from the amendment, which was agreed to in a bipartisan vote by both House and Senate, was expanded beyond Representative Aguilar's statement to include extremist organizations of all kinds, white nationalists, radical Muslims, gang members, and others who are not suitable to join the military." But Naveed, the reality is that specific language being changed or sort of added with other things added to it. We'll put a point in that. But we have a Military Times poll that shows that 22% of service members report that they have seen signs of white nationalism and racist ideology within the armed forces, and that's among 629 active duty troops last year. What do you make of that trend?
I think it's a trend we've all seen under Donald Trump, right? The idea, the normalization of white nationalism. Look, just to make clear, I want to put the distinction between white supremacy and white nationalism. White supremacy is the belief that the white race is superior, whereas white nationalism is essentially this idea that there should be a white ethno-state. Look, when you have policies that focus on the separation, the cruel treatment of brown people, in putting their children in cages, Muslim bans, when you have Stephen Miller essentially at the helm driving this, we've seen this normalization, and it's not surprising to me that that the military members are reporting this. That, again, as civilians, we've probably all seen this in the day-to-day. It is the normalization of white nationalism, the normalization that sort of racism gets put into the ether by saying it's not about saying whites are better than blacks or anything like that. It's about America first. It's about protecting America. But really, it's this veiled idea of white nationalism, which at its core is this belief that there should be a white ethno-state. And I'm not surprised, and I think that removing that language from the NDAA is sort of a hat tip to say we're normalizing this. Let's not make white nationalism stand out. Let's not separate it. Let's put it into everything else. Let's kind of make it seem like it's a less of a big deal than it is. But it really is, Joy. At the end of the day, this is what Trump is. It's normalizing this type of ideology, this type of behavior, and not just normalizing it through words, right? We have someone who's written policy that pushes these ideas.
Yeah, and Malcolm, there's a further breakdown in this bill that shows that nearly 42% of white troops said that they had experienced examples of non-white troops, I should say, said that they had experienced examples of white nationalism, but only 18% of white service members said the same. So it's not everyone who's reporting this across the board. But can you comment on the fact that whoever, we don't know which specific lawmakers decided to make this change, but there seems to be an emphasis on wanting to have Muslim extremism worded out specifically, but not white nationalism?
Well, that's the way that this administration has been running policy from the very beginning. There is no extremism or terrorism that could ever come from the white tribe as far as they're concerned. And it all comes from, brown people, Muslims, and things like that. I've been mentoring a young sailor who is now a journalist who was in the armed forces, who was, he was Caucasian, but he was a Muslim. And he was treated abysmally while he was assigned to his duty assignments, strictly because he was a Muslim. He didn't even look like what they think a Muslim looks like. What they do in the armed forces. And the reason that you have only 18% of people saying that they've, seen any of it is they are not the victims of it, and they are blind to it because they're not their friends are perpetrating it. I've actually had things happen in my armed service career that were good examples of white nationalism and white supremacy. Let me call one last point there. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, when they came up with their plan to blow up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City and kill 180 some odd American citizens, were white nationalists. They thought that by blowing that building up, there would be an uprising in the armed forces where soldiers would take their weapons and all the white soldiers would kill all the black soldiers. That failed to happen. But it was a belief structure that was not only in the armed forces at the time, but the book, the Turner Diaries, are still sold at gun shows and people talk about them.
Yeah.
This is a pervasive problem that the command level must squash from the top down. And if you have Congress watering down the language, well, then it will just continue to persist.
Yeah, and I mean, and we should point out that, the statement from the committee spokesperson was that they want to include everything, white nationalists, radical Muslims, gang members, et cetera, not calling out one or the other specifically, but that is what they decided to do. And, Naveed, we were talking the other day, the three of us were actually talking off air about it's so concerning to military leadership that when you have members of the Naval Academy playing what they're now saying was the circle game, and doing it on camera, it prompts an investigation within the military, which they're saying was not throwing the upside down OK white power sign, but that it prompted an investigation that it has to happen. You have situations where a U.S. Coast Guard lieutenant was accused of planning large-scale killing of civilians. We're starting to see that kind of investigation having to happen. It frightens me as a civilian to think that the military is also having to deal with this, because obviously this is an armed entity
Right.
with a lot of power and potential,
That's a very
access.
good point. And look, I think that, Joy, that should have been a teachable moment. Malcolm said it best, that this is, look, you're 18, 19 years old, you grow up in a small town, you're now suddenly, moving to people that with people you've never seen before. It's understandable that there might be a chance to learn here. But on the other flip side of this, when we talk about white nationalism, look, what is the main part of white nationalism or terrorism or any ideology is symbolism, is the idea of iconography, the idea that there are symbols that represent that ideology. Now, I don't doubt that those midshipmen and that West Point cadet were actually not doing the white power symbol, but it's got to be something that we teach. It shouldn't be something that's okay. They should understand why it's not okay to do that.
Yeah, and very quickly, I'm going to get you guys to quickly comment on this new Military Times poll, which is actually a different side of this coin. Donald Trump's, the view of Donald Trump within the military, very favorable, 24.3%, according to the latest Military Times poll. Favorable, 17.3%, neutral 8.5%, unfavorables 4.8%, but the biggest number of all is very unfavorable, 45.1%. What do you make of that really quickly, Malcolm, then Naveed?
Well, first, we don't suffer fools gladly in the armed forces. And believe me, we know when we see an idiot when we see one. And I know certainly at the senior NCO ranks where I was, our job is to recalibrate stupid. So when we see that coming from the commander-in-chief, where he's talking nonsense, we will follow all lawful and legal orders. We just will call it out when somebody asks us when a poll comes around.
Yeah. Do you think, Naveed, that Donald Trump's treatment of military veterans, I mean, he just belittled the former Michigan congressman, a beloved Michigan congressman who was a World War II veteran, the treatment of Khizr Khan and his family, the treatment of LaDavid Jones's family in Florida. Does that kind of thing eventually seep in to members of the armed forces?
Absolutely, and very quickly, look, the country is turning more brown and more progressive, and so is the military. When that military becomes more brown and progressive, and they start seeing their fellow citizens being treated poorly by the commander-in-chief, it's going to reflect pretty strongly on their views of him.
All right, Naveed Jamali, Malcolm Nance, two of our show favorites. Thank you guys for coming back. Appreciate it.
You got it.
Thank you.